A widow stood alone at the mouth of a cave, and the whole valley had come to watch her fail. They sat their horses in a cold half-circle behind her, silent, certain, waiting for the mountain to prove them right. Behind her, in the dark, her last animal stood tethered in stone. Everything she had left in this world. They had called it a tomb. They had told her a woman alone could not hold this hard land. They had told her to sell it and slink into town before she buried her stock and her name together in that hole in the ridge. She did not turn around. Her hands were raw. Her husband was 3 months in the ground, and a storm was gathering in the high country, the kind that decides who lives and who does not. She had bet everything on cold stone and a memory, and soon the earth itself would answer. The wind did not howl that morning. It waited. It moved low across the frozen valley the way something patient moves, something that knows it has already won. And at the mouth of a cave carved into a wall of pale stone, a woman knelt in the cold and refused to look up. Behind her, the men had gathered again, a dozen of them, maybe more, sitting their horses in a loose half-circle, breath steaming, saying nothing, which was its own kind of saying everything. They had come to watch her fail. They would not have used those words. They would have called it concern, neighborly worry, keeping an eye on the poor widow who'd lost her senses along with her husband. But she knew the difference between worry and appetite. And what sat behind her on those horses was appetite. Her name was Merritt Vale, 41 years old, though the last season had pressed a decade into her face. Her hands told the truer story, split at the knuckles, stained with rock dust, curled from months of gripping tools that fought her every inch of the way. She wore a heavy wool dress, belted with a strip of a man's leather, the hem cut short, practical, unbothered by what a lady's hem was supposed to do, a sheepskin coat gone dark at the wrists, a wide felt hat tilted against the sleet that had started to needle down out of a low gray sky. She did not turn to face the men. She simply kept working, setting a flat stone into the low wall she was building just inside the cave's mouth, testing its weight with the flat of her palm, steady, unhurried, as if the judgment gathered at her back weighed less than the rock in her hands. But steadiness like that is never born. It is carved. And to understand the woman kneeling in that cave, you have to go back to the man who once knelt beside her, back to before the silence, before the stone, before the whole valley turned her name into a joke told over coffee, back to when there were 2 of them against the winter. His name was Caleb, and Caleb Vale believed in the way things had always been done, the way other men believe in Scripture. A square barn, square corners, walls packed tight against the wind, a woodpile stacked higher than any neighbor's before the first frost fell. He had learned it all from his own father, and his father from his, and somewhere back along that line, the learning had stopped being a choice and started being a faith. He never questioned it. That was the thing about Caleb. He was kind. He was strong. He worked until his hands bled, and then he worked some more. But he never once asked the one question that might have kept him breathing. What if the old way has been failing us all along? They had built a life out there on almost nothing. 2 horses, a handful of milk cows, 11 sheep bought on a promise and a signature, For 2 seasons it held. And then came the winter that did not. It began with a sound, a long, low groan out in the dark. The sound of old timber giving way along a seam no eye had caught. The north wall of the barn had split, a crack no wider than a finger. But the cold outside was not measured in fingers. The cold was a flood, and the crack was a door thrown open to let it in. Caleb rose before the light. He did not hesitate. He never hesitated. Lantern in one hand, hammer in the other, a single board tucked under his arm, as if one board could hold back a whole sky. Merritt caught his sleeve at the door. "Wait for morning," she said. Quiet, almost a whisper. He looked at her the way a man looks at someone who simply doesn't understand. "By morning the stock'll be dead," he said, and he stepped out into the black. The door closed behind him, and the wind swallowed the rest. She found him when the sky had gone the color of ash, against the broken wall, not moving, the hammer still in his fist, the board half nailed, already glazed white with frost. He had not lost to the cold alone. Something had crept into his chest in those frozen hours, something quick and quiet and final. But kneeling beside him in that terrible dawn, Merritt understood a truth that no one would ever put on a headstone. Her husband had died guarding a wall that should never have needed guarding at all. He had given his life for the belief that suffering you could see was worth more than a quiet answer that simply worked. And the answer had been out there the whole time. He just never thought to look for it. They buried him on the rise above the cabin. The earth was frozen so deep the men had to burn a fire over the grave just to break the surface with their shovels. She wore black wool, the only good dress she owned, and gloves too large, borrowed because her own had worn through. She stood at the edge of that grave with the whole cold country stretched out behind her. No children, no family within reach of a season's travel. Just her, and the land, and every decision that land would ever demand. And as the men filed past, hats in hand, she heard it beneath their soft condolences, the thing they truly believed, that she would not last, that a woman alone could not hold ground this hard, that come spring, the cabin would sit empty, and the valley would go on as if she had never been there at all. She heard every word of it. She answered none of them. That night, she sat by a dying fire, the wind still worrying the walls, and she thought about the barn, not the wood and nails of it, the idea of it, the square, proud, respectable shape that every man in the valley trusted with his living. The barn Caleb built, the barn Caleb died to defend. And a thought rose up in her that felt almost like treason. It never worked. It had only ever looked like working because every single one of them failed the exact same way, every single winter, and called it the cost of living out here. Shared failure, wearing the mask of normal. She could not sleep. Somewhere past the cabin, past the frozen creek in the last dark line of the pines, a ridge of pale stone rose out of the earth. She had passed it 100 times without a second glance, old, silent, holding, deep inside itself, a warmth the winter could not reach. A thing it had been quietly holding for longer than any barn had ever stood. She did not understand it yet, but something in her had already turned toward it. The valley had written her ending before the dirt on Caleb's grave had even settled. They were certain of it. They were wrong. Because the woman they'd already buried in their minds was about to ask the earth a question no one in that valley had ever dared to ask. And the earth was going to answer. The first winter alone did not break her all at once. It broke her the way ice breaks stone, slowly from the inside, one freeze at a time. There was a particular cruelty to how the season took things from her. It never took enough to end her outright. It only took and left just enough behind to make her keep trying. A lamb 1 week, a hen the next. The good milk cow gone thin and dry when she needed her most. And every loss came wrapped in the same quiet voice at the back of her mind. The voice that sounded a little like the men on the road. You should have sold. You should have gone. A woman can't hold this alone. She learned to work faster than that voice could speak. It was the only way she knew to keep it quiet. The mornings were the hardest. There is a certain kind of cold that arrives before the light, a cold that does not roar, but presses. It settles over a cabin like a hand laid flat against the roof, and it seeps down through every board, and it finds a sleeping woman even under 3 blankets and a husband's old coat. She woke to that cold every day, and every day, for one thin moment before her eyes opened, she forgot. She forgot the barn. She forgot the ledger. She forgot the grave on the hill. For one moment she was simply a woman in a bed, and the world had not yet ended. And then the cold reminded her. And she rose, and she pulled on the coat that still smelled faintly of the man who used to wear it, and she went out to see what the night had taken. The lambs went first. They were too small to hold their own heat against a draft no amount of straw could ever fully stop. She would find them in the gray light, curled where they had lain down to sleep, and simply not risen. She stopped naming them after the third one. Naming them cost too much. Then the older ewe. Then the young ram she had been counting on to build the flock back in the spring. She hauled their stiff bodies out across the packed snow because the ground was frozen far too hard to bury anything, and she laid them at the edge of the tree line, side by side, and she did not let herself weep. Weeping cost heat. She had begun to measure everything that way now. In heat, in hay, in the shrinking numbers of a ledger that told her, in a plain and pitiless hand, that she was losing. The valley had a word for a woman in her position. The word was finished. They did not say it to her face. They said it with their eyes at the general store, when she came in for salt and thread, and they went quiet. She learned to hold her chin level under those eyes. She learned that a straight back could be a kind of armor, even when the woman inside it was crumbling. But it was the horse that nearly finished her spirit, not death. Slow ruin is worse than death, when you have to watch it every single morning. Her good gelding, the strong one, the one her husband had traded 2 whole seasons of labor to buy. She watched him hollow out through the deep of that winter. She watched his ribs rise up through a coat that should have been thick and glossy and warm. He was eating twice what he should have. Not to grow, not to work, just to keep from freezing where he stood. He was burning himself alive to survive the very place that was meant to keep him safe. And every mouthful of hay he swallowed was hay she had bought on a signature and a promise. Every mouthful was another link in a chain that was slowly tightening around her land. She would stand with him in the dark of that failing barn, her forehead pressed to his gaunt neck, feeling him tremble against a cold that came straight through the walls as if the walls weren't there. "I'm sorry," she told him once. Barely a whisper. It was the only apology she allowed herself all winter. She could not afford the rest of them. She stood in that barn one gray afternoon, her hand flat on the gelding's thin neck, and something in her went very still. Not despair. She was past despair. Something colder and clearer than despair. This does not work. This has never worked. And they have told me, my whole life, that it was the only way. She burned the last of the woodpile before the thaw. The tall, proud stack her husband had built, the one he had measured himself against every autumn, the one he had been so quietly certain of, gone. Every last stick of it. And still the winter had teeth left in its mouth. In the end, she went to a neighbor and traded 3 days of fence work. Hard labor, in weather that split her knuckles open to the cold, just to keep her own cabin from going dark. She mended that fence with cracked and bleeding hands, and she thanked the man's wife for the coffee, and she rode home in the dusk past the barn that stood square and useless in the snow. The barn everyone in the valley swore by. The barn her husband had died inside of. When the creek finally cracked and ran again, she walked out into the mud and counted what was left to her. Fewer sheep. A ruined horse's health, slow to return. An empty woodpile. A ledger bleeding red down every column. And a barn. Standing tall against the pale spring sky. Solid. Respectable. Exactly the way a barn was supposed to look, having failed her at every single turn. That was the morning the anger came. Not hot anger. She had no heat to spare, even for that. A cold, patient, useful anger, the kind that does not scream, the kind that sits down at a table with a stub of pencil and begins, very quietly, to do the math. She had paid this winter in dead lambs and a broken horse and her own bleeding hands. The whole valley paid it, every year, in the very same coin. And every year they looked one another in the eye and called it the price of the land. She would not call it that anymore. She refused. Something had shifted in her, out there in the mud with the ledger in her head. For the first time since they burned a fire over her husband's grave, she was not asking the valley to let her survive. She was preparing to prove it wrong. But refusing a thing is easy. Replacing it is not. And for a long stretch of those thin spring days, she had no answer at all, only the question turning over and over in the dark, like a key working at a lock that would not give. If not the barn, then what? She turned it over while she hauled water. She turned it over while she mended what the winter had torn. She turned it over lying awake at night, staring up at a ceiling she could not see, listening to the last of the season's wind test the walls the way a patient animal tests a fence. If not the barn, then what? The answer, when it finally came, did not feel like a discovery. It felt like remembering something she had always known. It came to her at the table, the ledger open before her, the numbers offering nothing but more of the same bad news. Her eyes lifted from the page and drifted out the window, out past the mud and the melting drifts, to the pale ridge of stone that rose beyond the pines. And all at once she was standing somewhere else. A high pasture. A sky gone the color of a fresh bruise in the space of 10 short minutes. Hail coming down hard enough to sting straight through the wool of her coat. She had driven her sheep in a panic into the mouth of that very ridge, Into a stone hollow the hunters sometimes used to wait out weather, expecting the inside to be every bit as bitter and raw as the rock looked from without. And instead, she had stood just inside the opening, the hail hammering against the stone at her back like a fistful of thrown gravel, and felt the strangest thing settle over her. Warmth. No, not warmth exactly. Steadiness. The air holding calm and even and unbothered, while the whole world came apart just beyond the threshold. She had not thought of it once in all the time since. The memory had only waited, the way the most important things sometimes do, quiet and patient, folded away somewhere beneath the noise of ordinary living, until the day the need for them grows sharp enough to call them home. She set the pencil down very slowly, and she let herself ask the question that not one soul in that whole valley had ever dared to ask aloud. What if the building itself is the problem? What if no barn, however well made, by however good a man, could ever outlast stone that has held its warmth steady since before any of us drew breath? She had no schooling to name what she was reaching for, no book to point the way, no teacher but the winter that had just tried to kill her. But she knew it in her body, the way a body knows the shock of a cold water without needing a number to prove it. The earth held its heat. It gathered warmth across a whole slow-turning year, and it kept that warmth deep, indifferent to any single storm that screamed across its skin. The air above could swing wild between dawn and dark. The stone beneath it barely stirred at all. She meant to hand her animals over to that stone. She meant to let the earth do the work that no barn and no man had ever managed to do. She began carrying her tools to the ridge the very morning the ground gave enough to work. A borrowed pickaxe, a shovel worn thin at the blade, a hand drill from her husband's chest, its handle still shaped to a grip that no longer existed anywhere in the world. She held that drill a long moment before she used it the first time. Then she set her jaw, and she put it to the stone, and she did not let herself think about the hand that had held it before hers. The hollow was small, 12 feet deep, perhaps, 20 across, 9 tall at the mouth, where it faced the low southern light. She laid her palm flat against the inner wall that first morning, and she felt it. Faint, certain. That same impossible steadiness she remembered from the hailstorm. The stone did not care that the winter had been cruel to her. It did not care that she was alone, or in debt, or mocked from the saddle by men who had known her husband. It simply held. And something in her chest, clenched tight since the day they burned a fire over the grave on the hill, eased. Just a little. Just enough to lift the pickaxe again. The valley noticed within the week. Riders slowed their horses on the road to watch a widow vanish into a hole in a ridge, hauling rope and buckets and lengths of salvaged timber up the slope on her own back. The staring came first. The voices came after. A rancher stopped at the edge of her land one afternoon and did not trouble himself to climb down from his saddle. "You're throwing away your best months on a hole in the ground," he said. She kept working. "That cave will hold the damp. It'll rot your feed. Choke your stock dead before the first real snow even falls." She kept working. "Fix the barn your husband left you. That's honest labor. This," he nodded toward the dark mouth of the cave with something close to disgust. "This is a woman gone strange with her grief." Her hands stilled. A woman gone strange with grief. She turned and looked at him, held his eyes until he shifted in his saddle and glanced away toward the pines. "My husband's barn," she said, quiet and level, "is what killed my husband." Then she turned her back to him and set her chisel to the stone. He rode off, and she heard the tail of it circling the valley before the week was out, growing stranger with each retelling. But she had stopped by then, spending herself on words. Words had never carried a bale of hay. Words had never turned back a single degree of cold. So she gave the stone everything she had instead. She widened the mouth of the cave with slow, deliberate care, shaping it into a kind of throat that would draw the air inward gently. Instead of letting the wind come howling straight through the way it savaged any ordinary door. She cut a shallow trench along the floor, sloped just enough to carry any seeping water away from where the animals would one day stand. And she did not trust that it worked simply because it looked as though it should. She tested it, on her knees. Bucket after bucket poured near the entrance, watching where the water gathered, scraping and regrading the floor until nothing pooled anywhere a hoof might ever rest. That was the difference in her, though she could not have named it then. Her husband had trusted what looked right. She trusted only what she had tested with her own 2 hands. She built a low wall of flat stone just inside the mouth, knee-high, no taller. She had watched cold air move across her own land in the long, empty evenings after the funeral, when there was nothing waiting for her in the cabin but the fire and the silence. Watched the way the cold sank and pooled in every dip and hollow, heavy as water finding its level. Give that cold air a wall to climb, she reasoned, and most of it would simply slump back and drain away out the mouth of the cave, leaving the warmer air above the barrier undisturbed. No book had told her that. No man had ever taught it to her. She had learned it from looking, from the patient, unhurried, hungry watching that the men on their fine horses had never once in their lives thought to do. The low back of the cave, where the ceiling dropped, she made into her storeroom. Hay stacked to the rock, grain wedged into natural hollows in the stone that seemed almost carved to hold it, as though the ridge had waited 100 quiet centuries for someone to finally come and put it to use. The high middle became the place for the animals. She cut tie points straight into the walls, an inch of unwilling rock at a time, working until each one held firm against a hard testing pull. And near the ceiling she carved 2 narrow shafts, angled up toward the natural cracks that ran through the ridge, cracks she had found on her hands and knees by candlelight, chasing the faintest thread of a draft through the dark, until she traced exactly where each one broke the surface far above her. The warm air, being lighter, would rise and slip out through those shafts. The fresh air would draw in low, sliding gently across the barrier by the mouth. No draft the animals could feel against their hides, no howling gap, just a slow, steady breathing, in and out. The cave itself, alive in a way that stone had no business being alive, drawing breath and letting it go so quietly that a person could stand inside for a full hour and never once notice the rhythm that was holding them. The whole of it cost her almost nothing but her own flesh, a few coins for hinges and nails and canvas, and months, long, solitary months, most of them spent on her knees in the dark, perfecting a thing that not one living soul believed in but her. But the coins were not the true price. The true price was being measured somewhere else entirely, because she was not only building against the cold, She was building against a debt that grew hungrier every single week. He came up the track on a gray afternoon while she was carrying stone, her back bent low beneath the weight of it, a well-fed man in a good coat, the kind who never worked the land himself, but always somehow ate well off those who did. He carried the paper she had signed, for the sheep, for the hay, for the seed she had put into the ground on nothing but hope and a shaking hand. He did not raise his voice. Men who hold your whole future in their coat pocket rarely need to. I'll say it plain, he told her, his gaze drifting past her shoulder to the dark mouth of the cave with open distaste. You lost near a third of everything you owned last winter. She set down her stone. She said nothing. Lose that much again, he went on, and there is no square left between us. And if there is no square between us, he did not finish it. He let the silence finish it for him. The land, the cabin, the grave on the hill above them both. All of it balanced now on the thin edge of one more winter. He glanced once more at the cave, and something crossed his face that might have been pity, or might have been contempt wearing pity's borrowed coat. The whole valley thinks you've gone soft in the head, he said, not unkindly, which somehow made it land twice as hard. Digging yourself a tomb instead of tending an honest barn. He turned his horse, and he left the word behind him, on purpose, to do its slow, cold work in the dark. Tomb. She stood a long while after the sound of his horse had faded down the track, the pickaxe hanging loose from her hand, and the doubt rose in her then, rose high and cold, the way floodwater rises against a bank, until it lapped at the very edge of her resolve. What if they were right? What if grief truly had turned her strange? What if this hollow in the ridge was exactly the thing they named it? A grave she was carving with her own two hands, her animals and her future, and her very last chance all to be buried inside it together, sealed up in stone? The cave would not reassure her. The stone did not care whether she lived or died in it. That was the terror of the thing. And though she could not have said so on that gray afternoon, that was also the whole of its strength. She thought of the lambs she had stopped naming. She thought of the gelding's ribs, rising through his coat like the staves of a broken barrel. She thought of her husband, hammer frozen in his fist, dying for a wall that never once should have needed him at all. And the fear, slowly, hardened into something with a spine. She would not do that arithmetic again. She would not lay one more small body at the tree line and call it the honest cost of living out here. If there was any other answer anywhere in this hard and indifferent world, she would cut it out of solid rock with her bare and bleeding hands before she would ever quit. She lifted the pickaxe, and she went back to work. But the stone did not surrender its lessons cheaply, and her first true failure came upon her with no one at all there to see it, which, in the end, turned out to be a kind of mercy. She had finished the two air shafts, angled up toward the cracks, just as she had planned them. For a few days they worked beautifully. She would hold a candle to each opening and watch the flame lean steady and outward, and feel a fierce, private, secret pride swell up inside her chest. Then, in the deep of one night, the wind turned. She woke before dawn to a smell that had no business being where it was. Smoke. Her own small cook fire near the mouth of the cave, curling back inward, drifting down the throat of the hollow instead of out through the shafts the way it was meant to. She took up a candle and crawled to the rear on her hands and knees, and she watched the small flame gutter and lean, pulled not upward toward the ceiling, but sideways, along the floor. The air had begun to move wrong, turning back on itself, going stale and heavy in the dark. The cave had begun to breathe the wrong way, and she knew, kneeling there in the cold, with her candle guttering, exactly what stale air in a sealed space would do to a barn full of living animals. She spent the whole of the next day on her knees in the dim, candle in one hand, chisel in the other, a stub of charcoal to mark on the stone where the air ran true, and where it faltered, and where it died altogether. And by dusk, she understood exactly what she had done. The second shaft, angled just 3 or 4 degrees too shallow, catching a crosswind, instead of channeling clean up into the fissure above. She had built something almost right, and she had made the one mistake that matters more than any other mistake there is. She had let almost pass for finished the very same error that had doomed every timber barn in that valley for as long as anyone living could remember. Trusting a thing because it looked sound from the outside, never once testing it against the wind it had not yet met. That realization stopped her cold in the dark, because it meant she was not, after all, so very different from the man she had buried. He had trusted the visible, and she had very nearly done the exact same thing. But there was one difference between them, and it was the whole of everything. Her husband had never lived long enough to find his error. She had. So at first light, she reopened the shaft, alone with the borrowed drill, widening it, re-angling it, an inch of grudging rock at a time, until at last the candle flame inside it bent cleanly and reliably upward, no matter which way the wind pressed against the ridge outside. It cost her 4 more days. 4 days out of a summer already tilting hard toward autumn. 4 days she could not afford and took anyway, because a thing worth doing at all was worth doing until it was true. She paid for those days the only way she knew how, by rising earlier, by sleeping less, by pouring the loss into her own tired body the way she poured every other cost, and asking no living soul to help her carry the weight of it. And not one person in that whole valley ever learned how near her cave had come, that season, to failing in precisely the way they all swore it would. She never told them. Some things, she was learning, hold far more power when they stay yours alone. By the time the leaves along the creek began to turn gold and red, the work was very nearly done. Every angle tested, every grade checked over twice. The trench ran true. The shafts breathed clean. The low wall stood ready to turn aside the cold. She led her 2 horses inside on a cool, bright morning to learn how they would take to it. The older mare balked at the threshold, planted her feet, refused the dark of the opening with the whites of her eyes showing. Merritt did not force her. She only stood beside the animal, speaking low and even, her hand steady and warm on the halter, and let the mare's own slow curiosity draw her forward, one careful step, and then another, until the horse stood fully inside, her ears swiveling at the strange, deep quiet of the place, and calm. The younger one followed with no argument at all, drawn in by the smell of hay stacked warm and sweet at the back. She tied them both to the anchors she had carved with her own hands, and she lowered herself down onto the cave floor beside them, and she sat a long while in the dim, waiting for the panic the men had promised her, waiting for the choking, the distress, the proof that they had all been right and that she had been mad. And what came to her instead was a settling. The horses' breathing slowed. Their weight rocked gently, foot to foot, in the loose and easy way of animals that sense no danger anywhere near them in all the world. She sat in that quiet for a long, long time, and rising up through the exhaustion, and through the grief, and through the cold, constant shadow of the debt, she felt the faint, first edge of something she had very nearly forgotten how to hold. Not triumph. It was far too soon for triumph. Not even relief. It was closer to the way a person feels when they have been alone in the dark for a very long time, and finally, faintly, begin to sense that they are not quite as alone as they had believed themselves to be. The men still mocked her on the road. The debt still tightened, week by week, like a slow hand closing, and the winter was still out there somewhere, gathering itself in the high country. The winter that would decide, once and for all, whether she had been a woman of rare and quiet vision, or only a widow who had carved her own grave out of the mountain and led her last few animals down into it to wait. But she had asked the earth a question, and there, in the deep and patient dark of the stone, the earth had finally, quietly, begun to answer her back. By the time the first hard frost silvered the valley, the cave was finished, and the whole valley knew it. Word of a thing travels fast in a place where every homestead sits within a day's ride of every other. By then, the widow's stone shelter had become the standing joke of the season, the kind of story men told over coffee with a knowing smile, the kind of thing women murmured about after gathering, not quite cruelly, but with that anxious, pitying certainty that the poor woman had finally lost whatever sense had carried her through her first hard winter alone. She heard the edges of it, the way a person always hears such things. A conversation that stopped short when she walked in for salt and thread. A pair of eyes that slid away when she met them. She had learned to carry it the way she carried everything now, straight-backed, silent, and working, always working. There was a sharper edge to this particular mockery than to ordinary gossip, because she was not merely doing something strange. She was suggesting, whether she ever meant to or not, that the accepted way had been wrong the whole time, that the barns those men had built with their own hands, and their fathers before them, and their fathers before that, had been quietly failing all along. That repeating a thing for a lifetime did not make it wise, only familiar, and no man alive enjoys being told, even without a single spoken word, that he has spent his entire working life doing something wrong. She felt the shift in how they looked at her. At first it had been pity, the soft, dismissive pity a valley reserves for a widow it expects to bury by spring. But pity had curdled into something else as her stone shelter took shape. Something closer to resentment, because a woman you pity is a woman beneath you. And a woman beneath you cannot possibly be right about the thing you have staked your whole life on. So they needed her to fail, not out of malice, most of them, out of something worse than malice, out of need. If she failed, then the world made sense again. Then the barns were right, and the fathers were right, And a widow alone was exactly as helpless as a widow alone was supposed to be. She understood all of this. She understood it, and she said nothing, and she went on stacking hay. The man who came to make it official rode out on a still, cold morning, with 2 others at his back. His name was Thaddeus Roone. And in that valley, his word carried the weight of Scripture. He had run stock in the high country longer than most men had lived there. He had buried more than one hand and more than one kinsman to the cold and the work. He wore his years like a coat he had earned, and he considered it his plain right to speak plainly to anyone at all, widow or not. He was not a cruel man. That was the thing that made him dangerous. A cruel man she could have dismissed, but Thaddeus Roone believed, all the way down to the bone, that he had ridden out that morning to save her life. They found her at the mouth of the cave, moving the last of the hay inside, her horses already stabled in the dim behind her, her breath rising in soft, pale clouds against the gray of the morning. Roone did not dismount right away. He sat his horse a long moment, looking past her, into that dark opening in the stone, and something moved across his weathered face that she did not understand. Not yet. Something older than disapproval. Something that had nothing to do with her at all. Something closer to dread. Then he swung down out of the saddle, slow and deliberate, and walked to the threshold and looked inside for a long, long moment. And when he turned back to her, his jaw was set in the way of a man who has already decided every word he means to say. "I'm going to speak plain," he said, "and I'm going to speak in front of witnesses, because I want it remembered that I said it." The other 2 men shifted in their saddles behind him. "What you've built here," Roone went on, "is the most dangerous thing I have seen a person attempt on this land in all my years." She said nothing. She had learned that silence held its ground better than any argument. "It's a tomb," Roone said. The word landed in the cold air, and it hung there. The very same word the man who held her debt had used on that gray afternoon by the stone pile. As if the whole valley had agreed on it in advance. As if they had passed it hand to hand until it became the only name the thing could have. "You put living animals down in a hole like that," Roone said, and his voice carried the flat, unshakable certainty of a man who has never once in his life doubted his own experience. "And they'll do one of 2 things. They'll panic in the dark and break their legs clawing to get out. Or they'll suffocate slow on their own breath while you sleep a quarter mile off and never know a thing about it until you come out at dawn and find them gone." He took a step closer to the opening, and she saw it again. That flicker. That thing behind his eyes that did not match the hardness of his words. "Animals need light," he said. "Same as people do. You've pinned yours in the dark with no way out if that roof takes a mind to come down. And a roof like that." His voice dropped, low and strange. "A roof like that always takes a mind to come down. Sooner or later. That's the one thing stone can be counted on to do." The heavy-set man behind him spoke up then, red-faced with the cold. "This isn't husbandry," he said. "It's cruelty dressed up as cleverness." Merritt's eyes moved to him, held. He looked away first. "You're not a rancher," Roone said. And now his voice had dropped into something quieter than anger, something almost gentle, which struck harder than any shouting could have. You're a woman trying to do a man's work with a fool's method. If you had a lick of sense left in you, you'd sell this place. Move into town. Let a person who understands livestock take it off your hands before you shame yourself past all mending. And there it was, the thing underneath the thing. It had stopped being about the cave at all. It was about whether she had any right to be standing on this ground in the first place, whether a woman alone could make a single decision about her own land without a man leaning over her shoulder to correct it. She felt the old heat rise in her chest, not at the insult to the cave. She could bear that. She had tested the cave. She knew what the cave was. It was the other thing. Let a person who understands take it off your hands, as though the land were a burden she had wandered into by accident, as though the grave on the hill and the winter she had survived alone, and the 4 months on her knees in the stone, had all been the flailing of a woman who did not know her own mind. One of the others muttered something then, low, thinking she wouldn't catch it. A real man would have built a barn. She caught it. She caught every word, and for one moment, one dangerous moment, she felt the answer she wanted to give rise up hot in her throat. She wanted to tell them about the lambs she had stopped naming. She wanted to tell them about the gelding's ribs and the empty woodpile and the 3 days of fence work she had traded just to keep her own fire lit. She wanted to tell them that a real man had built a barn, and that barn had killed him. But she did not say any of it, because she had learned, across all those months, that heat was exactly what they were waiting for. Heat they could dismiss. A woman shouting was a woman come undone. A woman shouting only proved the point they had already decided upon before they ever climbed into their saddles. So she gave them the one thing they could not use. She gave them calm. She looked at the man who'd muttered it, then at Rune, then back at the dark mouth of the cave behind her, where her horses stood quiet and warm in the steady dim, entirely unaware of the argument being held over their fate. And when she finally spoke, her voice carried none of the fire the men so plainly expected. It was worse than fire. It was even. "I've done the math on the feed," she said. "Twice over. It's written in a ledger, if any of you cares to read it. I've tested the air with my own hands, in every kind of weather this land threw at me all summer long. I've measured the warmth of that stone against a thermometer I bought with my own money." She paused, let it settle into the cold. "I made my choice on what I saw with my own eyes, not on what any man here needs to be true." The silence that followed had a weight to it. "You're welcome to ride back out come spring," she said, "and see for yourselves which of us was right." Rune looked at her a long moment, and she watched something war behind his eyes, something that was not, she would understand much later, contempt at all. "We will," he said at last, "and I'll be the first man in this valley to stand up and say I told you so." They mounted up. They turned their horses. They rode off down the frozen track, and they left her there at the mouth of her cave with the word tomb still hanging in the air like frost. And she went back to stacking hay, her hands steady, because steadiness, she had learned, was the one answer a man like Thaddeus Rune could neither mock nor dismiss nor turn against her. But here is what she did not know. Here is what would not surface for a long time yet. Rune's certainty did not come from stubbornness. It came from a grave. Long before that morning, in a rough and broken country far to the west, a land of mining cuts and sudden killing storms, Thaddeus Rune had once had a younger brother. A boy, really. Bright and reckless and loved past all reason. In one long ago winter, that boy had crawled into a cut in the rock to wait out a storm, the way any sensible soul would. He never crawled back out. The stone came down on him in the dark while he slept, buried him deep and cold. And it took 3 long days, once the thaw finally let the diggers through, to bring his body up into the light again. Thaddeus Rune had been the one who found him. He had been the one who dug, and he had not set foot inside an enclosed stone space from that day to this. He had never once spoken of why. So when he stood at the mouth of the widow's cave and called it a tomb, he was not looking at her animals. He was looking at a boy's face he had spent a lifetime trying to forget. He was seeing, all over again, the earth open and swallow someone whole. And he had no intention, none at all, of standing by and watching it happen a second time. Not even to a stranger, not even to a woman he did not particularly like. His war against her cave was never prejudice dressed as expertise. It was grief, wearing the only clothes it owned. It was a broken man trying, in the clumsy and wounding way of broken men, to keep the mountain from taking one more life on his watch. But she did not know that yet. And so, to her, he was simply one more voice telling her she had no business standing on her own land. 2 people, each carrying a private grief the other could not see. Each certain the other was the danger. That is how it so often goes, between people who are both, in their own way, right. The mockery spread through the valley like frost creeping across a window pane in the night. By the deep of the season, defending her had become impossible for anyone who might have quietly wished to, because to defend her cave was to say, out loud, in front of your neighbors, that the men who had ranched this land for a lifetime did not understand it half so well as they believed. And no one had the stomach for that. There was one woman, though, a neighbor named Della, who lived a short ride to the east, with a quiet husband who said little and watched much. Della had followed the widow's strange progress through the whole long summer with a curiosity she never once dared to speak aloud. She had ridden past the cave more than a few times, slowed her horse, taken in the low stone wall, the carefully carved trench, the neat, deliberate stacking of the hay, and then ridden on, without stopping, without a word, telling herself it was only caution, suspecting somewhere deep beneath that it might be closer to cowardice, because Della had begun to wonder, privately, in the dark, where no living soul could hear her think it, whether the widow might actually be on to something. And that wondering frightened her more than she could put words to. Because if the widow was right, then every barn in the valley was wrong, including the one her own animals stood shivering in each night, including everything her husband believed. And some truths are too expensive to say out loud. So Della kept her silence and rode past, and hated herself just a little each time for doing it. The season turned colder, and the whole valley settled in to watch. They broke the ice on their water troughs each morning with an axe. They hauled extra feed against the rising hunger of their stock. They checked their barn walls daily for the new cracks the deep cold always opened, and they burned through their wood piles at a rate that had every household quietly counting how long the supply might hold against how much of the winter still remained. They watched the widow's land the way a person watches a pot they expect at any moment to boil over, waiting, almost hoping, because her failure would be a comfort to every one of them. Her failure would mean they had been right to laugh. And then, one still gray morning in the deep of the season, the sky in the high country changed. It went the color of old iron, heavy and low and wrong. The air took on a stillness that anyone who had lived through a hard winter knew in their bones to fear. The kind of stillness that comes just before the mountain decides to show a valley exactly what it is capable of. Merritt Vale stepped out of her cabin that morning and looked up at that iron sky, and she felt her heart begin to beat harder, not from fear of the cold, from something closer to the feeling a person has when the moment they have prepared for their whole life finally begins to arrive. Everything she had built, everything she had bled for, everything the valley had laughed at. It was all about to be tested against something that did not care in the slightest what anyone believed. The storm came down out of the high country like something with a grudge. It did not build slowly. It arrived. The wind came first, tearing down through the passes, bending the pines flat to the ground, driving the snow sideways so hard it seemed to move parallel to the frozen earth. And it did not stop. Not that day, not that night, not the day after. It settled over the whole valley, and it refused to lift, a sustained and howling fury unlike anything the land had shown in longer than most could remember. Snow climbed over the fence lines and buried the gates shut. Barn doors froze solid in their frames, and men had to chip and pry at the hinges with numb and clumsy hands just to reach the animals trapped inside. Animals in barns that were losing whatever thin heat they had ever managed to hold. The cold pressed down and down, past the point where breath turned to ice crystals before it fully left the mouth. Past the point where grown men wept openly into their collars as they fought their way across their own yards toward stock they were terrified they would find already dead. And across that whole shrieking valley, in barn after timber barn, the animals huddled together in the corners, shivering hard enough that afterward some swore they had heard bones rattling beneath frozen hide. The widow stood at the mouth of her cave on the second night of it, bundled in 2 coats over her wool dress, a scarf wound twice across her mouth against a cold that would take fingers and toes from anyone careless enough to bear them for more than a few minutes. She watched the wind tear visible sheets of white across the black ground between her cabin and the ridge. She had already walked that 1/4 mile twice that day, once at first light, once at midday, and she meant to walk it again before the dark closed in for good, storm or no storm, because the discipline she had built across all those long, careful months felt in that howling moment like the only thing standing between her animals and disaster. Fear was out there in the storm. She would not pretend otherwise. But she had learned something about fear across the loneliest year of her life. Fear was not a wall. Fear was a wind. You did not argue with it. You did not wait for it to stop. You simply lowered your head, and you leaned into it, and you kept walking toward the thing that needed doing. And inside the cave, inside, away from the wind that screamed across the open ground. It was quiet. The thermometer hung from its beam near the mouth, and its reading held. Steady. As steady as it had held every single night since the snows first began. The stone did not know the storm was there. The earth did not feel the cold the way flesh and timber felt it. 20 feet of solid rock stood between her animals and the killing air beyond. 20 feet of patient stone that had gathered its warmth across a whole slow-turning year, and now gave it back, without complaint, without hurry, without any thought at all for the fury outside. It drank the cold pressing against its outer face. It spread that cold across its own enormous, patient bulk. And it gave the animals sheltered within it nothing in return but a slow, steady, survivable warmth, asking of them only that they stand still and breathe and wait for the world to right itself again. Her horses stood quiet through the worst of that second night, flicking an ear now and then at some sound that reached them faint and far through the stone, but never once rising to anything close to the panic Thaddeus Rune had promised her with such certainty. Her few remaining sheep slept in a loose, warm pile against the rear wall, dry, untroubled, unable even to properly hear the storm that was trying so very hard to kill them. She sat with them a long while that night, her lantern throwing a small circle of gold against the ancient stone. And she thought about the men, about Rune, and his word hanging in the frozen air, tomb, about the ones who had muttered that a real man would have built a barn. She thought about them out there in the screaming dark, right at that very moment, chipping at frozen hinges with bleeding hands, losing animals they had raised up from birth, burning through the last of their wood and watching their children shiver under every blanket in the house. And she felt no triumph in it. That surprised her. She had expected, somewhere deep down in a place she was not proud of, that this moment, if it ever came, would taste like victory. It did not. It tasted like grief, because she knew, better than any of them, exactly what it was to lose an animal to the cold, to kneel in the straw with a small dying body warm and then not warm in your hands, and be able to do nothing at all but hold it. She would not have wished that on a single one of them, not even the man who had called her a fool to her face in front of witnesses because he wanted it remembered. And that, more than the warm stone, more than the steady thermometer, was the thing that had changed in her across that long and solitary year. The valley had tried to make her hard. It had failed. It had made her strong instead. And strength, she was learning, was not the same as hardness at all. Hardness was the barn, square and proud and brittle, cracking along its seams the moment the true cold came. Strength was the stone, patient, yielding nothing, and warm all the way through, to anything that took shelter inside it. She rose. She checked her tie points, one by one. She ran a hand down the flank of the older mare, and the horse leaned its great weight into her palm, warm and calm and unafraid. And she pulled her scarf back up across her mouth to make the long walk home through the storm. But she stopped for just a moment at the mouth of the cave. She looked out into the roaring white. Somewhere out there, past that churning wall of driven snow, the valley that had called her a fool was fighting for its very life. And here, at her back, in the deep and patient dark of the stone, her animals stood warm, She did not yet know how the storm would end. She did not know whether the days ahead would prove her right, or whether some failure she had not foreseen was still crouched somewhere in the dark, waiting to undo everything. The winter was not finished with her. She understood that much. But standing there, in the very mouth of the thing the whole valley had named her grave, she felt the stone breathing steady and slow at her back, in and out, indifferent to the fury just beyond the threshold, patient in the way that only the earth itself can afford to be. And for the first time since they had burned a fire over her husband's grave to soften the ground, she was not afraid of the winter. She turned, and she stepped out into the storm, and she leaned her head into the wind and began the long, cold walk home, certain at last of one single thing in all the churning white world. Whatever the mountain chose to do next, the stone would hold. On the fourth morning, the wind simply stopped, not gently, not the way a storm usually loosens its grip, hour by hour, until you hardly notice it has gone. It stopped all at once, as though the mountain had spent everything it had and had nothing left to give. The silence that followed was almost worse than the roar had been. A brittle, exhausted silence, the kind that settles over a place after something terrible has passed through it. Merritt Vale stepped out of her cabin into a world that looked scraped clean of warmth. The valley lay white and still beneath a hard, pale sun. Every surface glazed with ice that caught the light in sharp, unforgiving glints. And rising up from the scattered homesteads across the basin, thin, anxious columns of smoke. She stood on her porch a moment and read those columns the way another woman might read a letter. Each one was a family burning through the last of what they had. Each one was a fire built too high, too desperate, in a final effort to keep something alive through the worst the season had brought. Each one was the visible cost of survival. Everywhere she looked. She began the walk to the cave. Her boots crunched through drifts that came up past her knees and in places past her waist, so that she had to push through them with her whole body, one hard step at a time. A quarter mile had never felt so far, and with every step, a question climbed higher in her chest. She had trusted the stone. She had staked everything on it. Her animals, her land, her last chance in this hard country. But she had never tested it against this. Not against 4 days and nights of a cold that killed grown men in their own yards. What if the thing had a limit she had never found? What if she reached the mouth of the cave and pushed through the door and found only stillness on the other side? She did not let herself finish the thought. She simply pushed through one more drift, and then another. And then she was at the door. Her hands shook as she worked the outer latch, not from the cold. She had stopped feeling the cold somewhere back across the field. She pulled the outer door open, pushed through the inner one, the canvas and wool one, the one she had built to trap the warmth, and she stepped inside. Warmth. It met her the way it always had. Steady, even, unbothered. The same warmth that had held every single day since the snows first fell. And in the dim gold light of the space, her animals stood. All of them. The older mare turned her head at the sound of the door and flicked her ears, unhurried, as if to ask why the woman was standing so still in the entrance. The younger horse shifted its weight, foot to foot. The sheep stirred in their loose pile against the rear wall, warm and dry, and one of them lifted its head, blinked at her, and lay back down. Not one of them lost, not one of them shivering, not one of them any the worse for 4 days that had gutted every other herd in the valley. She crossed to the thermometer on its beam. Her breath was steady now, though her hand still trembled as she reached for it. She read the number, and she read it again, because the first time she was not quite able to believe her own eyes. The stone had held. Through everything. Through the worst the mountain could summon. The earth had done exactly what she had trusted, on nothing but instinct and stubbornness and a memory of hail it would do. She wrote the number into her ledger, the same ledger that held her husband's death and her first winter's losses, and every red-inked failure of the year behind her. Her hand shook as she wrote, not from cold, from something she did not yet have a word for, something between disbelief and a fierce, quiet, private joy. She stood there a long while in the warm dim, and she waited to feel triumphant. She had earned it, hadn't she? The whole valley had laughed. The whole valley had called her a fool, called it a tomb, told her to sell her land and slink into town before she shamed herself. And she had been right. She had been right all along. But the triumph did not come. What came instead was quieter, and stranger, and far more tender than triumph. She looked at the older mare, the one whose ribs she had counted through a coat gone thin the winter before, the one she had pressed her forehead against in the dark of the failing barn and whispered, "I'm sorry to," when she had nothing else to give. That horse was standing warm, standing sound, alive when by every rule the valley believed it should not have been. And she felt her throat tighten, and her eyes sting, and she let them. There was no one there to see. The stone did not care if a woman wept inside it. So for the first time since they had buried her husband on the hill, she did, not from grief, from the opposite of grief, from the almost unbearable relief of having, at last, saved something. But the winter was not finished with her, and the deepest test of that long season was not the storm at all. It came 3 nights later, and it came from inside the cave itself. There was a cow among her small herd, heavy with calf, due by the widow's own careful figuring, still weeks away. That night, the cow began to move wrong. Merritt heard it from the mouth of the cave before she saw it. A low, distressed bawling. A sound entirely unlike the ordinary shifting of animals in the dark. She was at the cow's side within moments, lantern held high, her heart already beginning to hammer. And she knew, the instant she looked, that the calf was coming, weeks early. In the dead, cold heart of the hardest winter the valley had seen. She knew, too, that something was wrong. The cow strained and strained again, and nothing came. Merritt set the lantern where its light would fall best, and she pushed back her sleeves, and she reached in to feel for the trouble. And she found it. One foreleg, folded back where it should have been extended forward. The calf was turned wrong, locked, unable to come. She had seen this once before, a long time ago, in another life, watching an older woman work at just such a berth alongside a hired man on a distant farm. The memory was thin, worn faint with the years, but it was the only thing she had. That and her own 2 hands. There was no one to call. She understood that with a clarity that was almost calm. No neighbor within reach through the drifts. No man to send for. No help coming, tonight or any night. Just a woman, alone, on her knees, in the lantern light. And a life trying to come into the world the wrong way. And another life, the mother's, hanging on whether that woman's hands could set it right. She worked, her arm inside the birth canal, past the wrist, then past the elbow, feeling in the dark for the folded leg, trying to ease it forward without tearing anything, without losing either the calf or the mother to a moment of clumsiness born of a fear she could barely hold down. The cow strained against her, bawled, fought, and Merritt held steady. Sweat ran down her back despite the mild air of the cave. Her arm ached, then burned, then went past burning into a kind of numb, trembling exhaustion. An hour passed, then more. The leg would not come. There was a moment, deep in that long night, when she felt herself begin to break. When the exhaustion and the fear and the sheer impossible aloneness of it rose up all at once and nearly took her under. Her arm was shaking. Her strength was failing. The cow was tiring, and a tiring cow was a dying cow, and a dying cow meant 2 lives lost instead of 1. And in that moment, kneeling in the straw with her arm inside a laboring animal and no living soul within a mile of her, she spoke to no one, to the stone, to the dark, to the husband on the hill, to whatever might be listening in a night that cold. "I can't lose this one too," she said, and her voice cracked wide open in the empty stone chamber. "Please, I can't." And then, slowly, under her searching fingers, the leg gave. It eased forward, straightened, slid into place, and the calf followed within minutes, slick and steaming faintly in the mild air, and shaking and breathing, alive. She sat back hard against the cold stone wall. Her arms hung useless at her sides, trembling, streaked to the elbow, and she watched. She watched the cow turn, slow and instinctive, and begin to lick her calf clean. Watched the small ribs rise and fall. Watched the little thing lift its wet head and blink at a world it had entered far too soon, in the deep, cold heart of a killing winter, and live anyway. Because the stone had held its warmth around them both. Because the mother had had enough reserve left, enough steady heat, to survive a birth that exhaustion and cold would have turned fatal anywhere else in that whole frozen valley. She stayed with them until dawn, too wrung out to make the walk back to her cabin, too full of something she could not name to have wanted to, even if she could. And when the gray light finally crept in around the edges of the door, she took up her ledger, her handwriting looser than usual, her hand still faintly shaking, and beneath the bare facts of the night, she allowed herself one single line that was not a fact at all. "The stone held steady through everything I could not control." She looked at that line a long moment. Then she closed the ledger, and she understood something, sitting there in the dawn with a living calf steaming in the straw at her feet. That calf would not have lived in a timber barn. She knew it the way she knew her own name. She had watched her neighbors lose full-term calves to far gentler troubles simply because the cold had worn the mothers down past the point of saving. The stone had not delivered this calf. Her own 2 hands had done that. But the stone had given the mother the strength to survive her hands. The stone had taken one danger off the table. and that had made all the difference in the world. She did not tell anyone about that night, not for a long while, not out of secrecy, but because the thing sat too close to her chest to hand over easily. The way grief for her husband had sat close for months before she could speak his name without her voice catching. Some things a person has to carry alone for a time, before they can bear to set them down where others can see. The valley, meanwhile, had begun to stir, because smoke tells a story, if you know how to read it. And there was one homestead in the basin whose chimney had stayed thin and quiet all through the worst of the cold. One homestead whose stock, glimpsed from the road, looked fat and sound while everyone else's had gone gaunt and hollow-eyed. Men noticed. They did not speak of it at first, not to her, barely even to each other, but they noticed, and a thing noticed cannot be unnoticed. It was Della who came first. She rode the short distance to the east on the morning after the drifts had settled enough to travel, her own losses sitting heavy in her saddlebags like stones she could not set down. A few hens, a goat, gone to the cold, despite every blanket her quiet husband had nailed across the coop. She had spent the worst of the storm pressed against her own children in the dark, listening to the wind try the walls of the house the way a hungry animal tries a fence. And she had ridden out that morning expecting to find, at last, the disaster she had half suspected all autumn. She had ridden out, if she was honest with herself, almost wanting to. Because if the widow had failed, then Della's own silence all those months had been wisdom. Then her cowardice had been caution after all. What she found instead stopped her cold at the mouth of the cave. The widow was hauling water. Just hauling water. As if it were any ordinary morning. And beyond her, through the open door, the animals stood, calm, sound, their breath rising soft and unhurried in the dim gold light. Della sat her horse a long moment, unable to make what she was seeing agree with the night she had just survived. Then she dismounted, without quite deciding to, and she walked to the threshold. And the question came out of her before she had fully formed it. How warm is it in there? Merritt glanced at the thermometer on its beam. She said the number. Della blinked. The number would not settle into anything she could reconcile with the world outside. That's... She stopped. Started again. During a night that dropped past anything I've ever felt. The coldest it fell in here all winter, Merritt said, her voice carrying no triumph in it at all, only the flat report of a woman reading a figure off a page. Was a good deal warmer than that, and that was weeks back, during the first real cold. Della stepped inside. The air settled around her, cooler than her own kitchen, yes, but nowhere near the violence she had braced herself against, and dry. That was the thing that struck her hardest. Not the warmth, the dryness. The hay smelled fresh, sweet. Not a trace of the damp rot that crept into every barn she had ever known by the deep of winter. An odor she had stopped even noticing because it never went away. Here, it simply was not there. The animals looked better fed, better rested, sounder than her own stock had looked even before the storm took its toll. She stood in that strange, still, dry warmth, and she felt something shift in her chest that she could not take back. "How much feed are you going through?" she asked. Merritt pulled the ledger from a shelf carved into the stone, its pages soft now from months of handling. She gave the figure. "My horses are holding their weight," she said. The cows are still giving milk. I haven't lost a single animal since I moved them in." Della did the arithmetic in her own head without meaning to. The way a woman who has managed a household budget for years cannot help but do. Her own barn was burning through a third more feed than that. A third more. For stock that, by any honest measure, looked worse off than the widow's. "And water?" Della asked. Quieter now. "Once a day," Merritt said. "It doesn't freeze in here. No second trip. No breaking ice." Della stood a long moment in the warm dim, and something moved across her face that was harder to watch than grief. It was shame. The shame of a woman who had known, somewhere deep, for months, and had said nothing. Who had ridden past this cave a dozen times, seen the careful trench and the low stone wall, and the neat stacked hay, and told herself it was foolishness, because believing otherwise cost too much. "You need to tell people about this," Della said at last. And Merritt looked at her, and for the first time, something almost like a smile touched the corner of her mouth. Tired and knowing. "People already know," she said. "They just haven't decided to believe it yet." Della rode home through the white glare of that morning with a great deal to think about. She did not go straight to her husband. She was not ready. But something had changed in her, out there in the widow's cave. She had gone in hoping, in some small ugly corner of herself, to find a woman brought low. And she had found instead a woman who had simply been right, quietly, patiently, alone, for a whole long year, while a valley laughed. And Della understood, riding home, that the laughing was over now, whether the valley knew it yet or not. Something had begun that morning that could not be stopped. Not word exactly. Word would come later. Something slower and deeper. The first crack in a wall of certainty that a whole valley had leaned against for as long as any of them could remember. Because Della had felt the dry, warm air with her own skin. She had smelled the sweet, unrotted hay. She had done the arithmetic and seen it come out impossible. And a thing you have felt with your own body, a thing you have proven against your own experience, that is a thing you cannot unknow. No matter how badly, some quiet part of you might still wish to. The widow, for her part, went back to hauling water. She had a calf 3 days old now, growing stronger by the hour. She had a herd to feed. She had a ledger to keep. And she had, at long last, something she had not felt since before the fire burned over her husband's grave. Not triumph. She still had no use for triumph. Something better. She had the quiet, unshakable certainty of a person who has stood alone against the doubt of everyone around her, and watched her own faith survive the very worst the world could throw against it. The valley had called her a fool. The valley had called her cave a tomb. And the tomb had become, on the coldest nights of the hardest winter anyone could remember, the only warm and living thing for miles. She set down her buckets. She looked out across the frozen basin, at the thin, anxious columns of smoke rising from every home but her own. And she thought, with no bitterness left in it at all, only a deep and hard-won peace. The earth never needed anyone to believe in it. It only needed someone patient enough to stop arguing and listen. The word did not spread the way she expected it to. It did not come as a flood. It came the way the thaw comes to that high country, slowly, one drip at a time, until you look up one morning and the whole world is running with water. At first, it was only the small things. A man would mention, almost in passing, over coffee at the store, that the widow's stock looked fat for the season. Another would note that her chimney smoke stayed thin and quiet, when every other house in the basin was burning wood like it was the last winter on earth. The talk carried no admiration yet, only a kind of uneasy curiosity. The sound of men trying to make what they had predicted agree with what they were beginning to suspect they had gotten wrong. Thaddeus Roone held out longer than most. He had lost a good part of his herd across those killing nights. Animals he had raised from birth. Animals he walked out to count each dawn, his breath ragged with something closer to grief than to arithmetic. He had built his whole standing in that valley on a lifetime of hard-won judgment. And judgment, once spoken aloud in front of witnesses, does not bend easily, even when the evidence stands warm and breathing right in front of a man's own eyes. The one who broke first was not Roone. It was the old builder, a man named Walter Hale, who had raised nearly every barn standing within a long day's ride, and who had told the widow to her face, back in the autumn, that her cave would sweat and rot and breed sickness by the deep of winter. He rode out alone on a gray morning, no audience this time, no one to perform his certainty in front of. He carried a small moisture meter he had built himself years back from a design he'd once seen in a builder's pamphlet, and he spent the better part of 2 hours inside that cave, running his palm along the stone at different heights, checking the hay near the mouth against the hay stacked deep in the back, measuring the ceiling near the air shafts, where he had been so certain the damp would gather and freeze and bring the whole thing down in rot. He found almost nothing, a faint dampness near the outer door where the warm inside air met the cold at the very edge of the opening. Nothing more, nothing near the ruin he had promised. He sat down on an overturned feed bin, and for a long while he said nothing at all. His jaw worked the way a man's jaw works when he is chewing on something a good deal harder than food. "I've built more barns than I can count," he said finally, his voice lower than the widow remembered it, stripped of the certainty it had carried in the autumn. "And not one of them would have carried your animals through what just passed." He looked around the warm, dim space. "You weren't guessing when you built this," he said. "You were engineering something I didn't have the eyes to see." Merritt said nothing beyond a small nod. She had learned, across her long solitary year, that some admissions do not need an answer, only the dignity of being allowed to stand on their own. But an idea, once it spreads, does not stay in the careful hands that first shaped it. And that was the thing she had never thought to fear. It began with the young ones, the eager ones, the men with land and hope and not quite enough patience. One of them, a young rancher named Cole Ferris, with a stretch of stony ground to the south, began visiting her twice in the span of a few days, sketching in a notebook, asking about the angle of her air shafts and the grade of her drainage trench with a directness that was almost startling after a whole season of scorn. She answered every question he brought her. She walked him through the whole of it, point by point. The height of the barrier wall, the angle of the shaft she had reworked after her own failure in the summer, the grade of the trench she had tested with buckets of water before she ever set a chisel to it. She did not hide her mistakes from him. She understood, watching him scribble with the eager focus of a man building something that mattered to him, that her failures were worth as much to him as her successes, perhaps more. Because a man who knows where a thing can fail is a man far less likely to repeat the failure himself. And that was exactly the trouble, because Cole Ferris listened to the answers he wanted to hear, and he did not quite listen to the rest. Word reached her on a cold morning near the turn of the season. One of the new caves, a copy of her own, built by Ferris on his stony southern ground. The ceiling near the mouth had come down, a partial collapse, under the weight of a heavy snow load, the very thing Rune had warned against that first morning, the very word he had used. A roof like that always takes a mind to come down. Her stomach turned to ice when she heard it, because for one terrible moment, she thought Rune had been right all along, that the stone truly was a killer, and she had been the one to hand the whole valley the means to bury themselves. She rode out to the Ferris place within 2 days, uninvited, carrying nothing but her own measuring line and the hard knowledge of exactly how a cave mouth needed to be cut to stand through a winter. What she found at the collapse steadied her, even as it frightened her in a different way. No one had been hurt. The ceiling had come down in the dark hours before the animals were ever moved in. A stroke of fortune that could just as easily have gone the other way. She knelt at the fallen rock and read it the way she read everything, with her hands, with her eyes, patient, unhurried. And she understood, within minutes, exactly what Ferris had done. He had copied the shape of her cave, but not the reason for it. He had widened his mouth far past where hers stood, chasing more daylight for the interior, and in doing it, he had pulled away too much of the stone that held the ceiling up, left the rock above the threshold to carry a weight it was never meant to bear. Ferris stood beside her, less defeated than simply bewildered. "I followed the drawings," he said. There was a helplessness in his voice, the helplessness of a man who had trusted a thing he did not truly understand. "I don't know what I did different." "You cut your mouth too wide," she said, still kneeling, still reading the broken rock. She looked up at him. "That measurement isn't a suggestion. It's the widest this kind of stone can carry without losing the ceiling. Every foot past it takes support away from exactly the place that needs it most." And in that moment, kneeling at the wreck of another man's copy of her own life's work, something shifted in her understanding of what she had become. She was no longer just a woman who had solved a problem for herself. She had become, whether she had ever sought it or not, the only person in the whole valley who fully understood why the solution worked, which meant she carried a responsibility now toward every clumsy imitation of it, toward every animal that would ever be led down into stone by a man who had copied her shape and missed her reason. A responsibility she had never asked for, and could not, in good conscience, refuse. She helped Ferris salvage what could be salvaged before the real cold came, and then she went home. And she sat a long while at her table, and she made a decision that would cost her more of that winter than she yet knew. She began to ride a circuit of her own. Every new cave in the valley, every copy, every borrowed piece of her work. She rode out to each one, and she measured the mouths, the shafts, the drainage grades, all of it against her own hard-won standards. She found 2 more mouths cut too wide, She found one trench so shallow it would flood the animals out come the spring melt. She found one air shaft angled so steep it would catch a crosswind and turn the whole cave stale, the very mistake she had made herself, alone in the dark, in the summer. She corrected what she could correct in a single visit. She marked the rest with measurements the owners could finish on their own, and she rode home each evening bone-tired in a way that had nothing to do with the work. Tired in the way a person gets when they have become, without ever choosing it, the standard against which a whole valley's safety is now measured. Thaddeus Roone rode that circuit beside her. Not for all of it, but for some. He had spent that autumn finishing a cave of his own, on a rock face along the eastern edge of his land, which was a thing she never once let herself remark upon out loud. The man who had called it a tomb, carving his own shelter into the very stone he feared. He said little on those rides. So did she. But there was a quiet between them now that had not been there before. The quiet of two people who have stopped needing to prove anything to each other. It was on the ride home from one of those visits that he finally asked her the question that had clearly been sitting on him for some time. "Why didn't you let Ferris figure it out on his own?" he said. "Let the cost of copying without understanding fall where it should have fallen. On him." She considered it a long moment, her horse's hooves crunching steady through the thin new snow. "Because it wasn't going to fall on him," she said at last. "It was going to fall on every animal he put down in that stone, every animal that never once chose to trust the thing he built for them." She was quiet a moment. "I built mine to answer for myself," she said. "I never meant it to put anyone else's stock at risk, because they copied the shape of what I did, and not the reason underneath it." Roone rode in silence a while after that, and when he finally spoke again, his voice carried a weight it had not held before. "You've built something bigger than a stable," he said, "whether you wanted to or not." She did not know, riding home that evening, how soon those words would be put to the test. But the winter was not done with her. It had one more thing to ask, and this time it would not ask it of her cave at all. It would ask it of her heart. The second storm came near the turn of the season, smaller than the first, less raw, less killing in its cold. But it carried something the first storm had not. It carried snow. Sustained, heavy, relentless snow, falling for day after day without a pause. The kind of accumulation that does not test how warm a shelter can stay, but how much weight a shelter can bear. The patient, grinding weight of snow, piling higher and higher against every rooftop and every entrance across the basin. Her own cave held it without complaint, her carefully cut mouth, her carefully judged proportions, all of it doing exactly what she had shaped it to do, absorbing the load the way stone absorbs everything, slow and indifferent. But on the 5th or 6th day of it, word came to her, carried by a rider half frozen in his saddle, who had pushed his horse hard through the drifts to reach her. One of the new shelters was failing. A hybrid, this one. Timber built directly against a rock face, with a back wall of stone to hold the warmth. Built on the land of a man named Silas Barrow. She knew the name. Silas Barrow. He had been one of the two men who rode out with Roone that first morning, one of the two who had sat their horses and watched and agreed, while Roone called her cave a tomb. Barrow was the one who had muttered it, low, thinking she wouldn't hear. A real man would have built a barn, She had heard it. She had carried it, quiet, for a whole long season. And now his shelter was tearing itself apart. The seam where the timber met the stone was pulling open. The two materials expanding and shrinking at different rates in the deep cold, working against each other, straining to rip the whole structure apart at the exact joint where its strength mattered most. 14 head of cattle stood inside it, and it was coming down around them. She sat at her own table, with the rider's words still ringing in the small, warm room, and for the first time since this whole long, accidental burden had settled onto her shoulders, she felt something rise in her chest that was very close to anger. She had not asked for this. She had built one shelter for her own animals. She had tested it alone and corrected it alone, and nearly died of the loneliness of it more than once. And somehow, in the turning of the seasons, that private thing had become a public duty she had never once agreed to carry. And now the man who had mocked her, the man who had called her a fool and muttered about real men and real barns, that man's animals were dying, and she was the only soul in the whole valley who knew how to save them. Della was there that afternoon. She had ridden over to wait out the worst of the snow, the way the two of them had fallen into doing, across that long, strange winter of a friendship neither had gone looking for. She watched Merritt sit motionless at the table. She watched her reach, slowly, for her coat. "You don't have to go," Della said. Her voice was careful. The words offered less as instruction than as a permission the widow might not otherwise give herself. "Nobody in this valley would think less of you if you stayed by your own fire tonight, least of all after what he said to you." Merritt looked down at her own hands, still raw from the morning's work, and she thought of 14 head of cattle, standing in the dark, in a shelter she had never inspected, waiting on a failure she alone understood how to stop. "I'd think less of myself," she said finally, already pulling the coat over her shoulders. "And that's worse." The ride took the better part of 2 hours, through snow that buried the trail past her horse's knees, through a white so thick that the world shrank down, in the worst of it, to a few yards of churning gray. Her face went numb past feeling despite every layer of wool she had wound against it, but she did not turn back. She had learned, out there in the loneliest year of her life, that fear was not a wall. Fear was a wind. You lowered your head, and you leaned into it, and you kept moving toward the thing that needed doing. She found Silas Barrow working alone in the failing light, trying to brace the tearing seam with green timber that bent instead of held. His hands raw and bleeding from hours of work that was accomplishing nothing at all against a problem his carpentry had never been built to solve. He looked up when she rode in, and she watched something break open in his face at the sight of her, because he knew what he had said to her, and he knew she knew. And here she was anyway, riding out of a storm that could kill a person to help the man who had called her a fool. Her eyes moved over the structure within minutes. She did not read it as a carpentry problem the way Barrow had. She read it as a problem of heat, and of stone, and of the way two different materials move against each other in the cold. "The wood's pulling away," she said, kneeling at the widening gap, her voice steady despite the wind tearing at her words, "because nobody figured how much the stone face shrinks in deep cold. against the timber braced up against it. You need a buffer between them, something that gives, something that can soak up the difference in how they move instead of fighting it. What kind of buffer? Barrow's voice cracked, with exhaustion, and with something close to despair. 14 head of cattle stood in the gathering dark behind him, animals that would not live through a collapse in cold like this. She looked around the failing structure a long moment, and her eyes settled on the answer, one she had never needed for her own cave, but recognized instantly from the same deep logic she had built her whole understanding around. Wool, she said, packed hay, anything that presses down without cracking. She was already moving toward his feed store. Layer it thick between the stone and the wood, thick enough that the stone can move against it, without ever once touching the timber. They worked together through the worsening storm, for hours, packing the failing seam with everything the place could give. The widow directing it all, with an authority that had nothing to do with her being a woman, and everything to do with the plain fact that she understood, more deeply than anyone alive in that valley, exactly how stone and timber and cold behaved against one another. And by the deep of the night, the seam held. The pressure that had been actively tearing it open only hours before eased. The buffer soaked up the movement exactly the way she had known it would. Barrow sat back against the cold stone wall when it was done, his breath ragged, his hands ruined, and his eyes found hers across the lantern light. And there was nothing left in them of the man who had muttered about real men and real barns. "You saved every animal I have," he said, his voice rough with something he made no effort at all to hide. "I don't know how a man settles a debt like that." Merritt gathered her tools. "You don't," she said. She looked at him a moment, not unkindly. "You just build the next one right. And when somebody laughs at somebody else for trying something new, you keep your mouth shut, and you go and see for yourself first." She did not say the rest of it. She did not need to. A real man would have built a barn. It hung in the air between them, unspoken, answered now, forever. She rode home through the tail end of the storm, well past the middle of the night, her body aching with a cold that even her own well-tested design had not quite prepared her for. And she found Della waiting at her cabin door, a lantern in her hand, an expression on her face that was so raw with relief it bordered on anger. "You could have died out there," Della said, her voice shaking. "Riding into that for a man who stood at your own cave and called you a fool." Merritt lowered herself onto the cabin step, the last of the strength going out of her all at once. "Maybe," she said. She was quiet a moment, looking out at the settling snow. "But his animals never called me anything," she said. "They just needed somebody who understood the trouble to show up before the cold finished what the storm started. And that, in the end, was the thing that changed the valley. Not the first storm, not the thermometer, not the fat stock or the thin smoke. It was the ride, the story of a widow riding 2 hours into a killing storm to save the herd of a man who had mocked her. That was the thing they could not laugh at. That was the thing they could not explain away, or resent, or fold back into their old certainties. Because it was not about stone at all. It was about the kind of person a body turns out to be when the cold comes. The season broke, at last, the way it always does, the wind loosening, the drifts sagging, the creek cracking somewhere down in the trees and beginning, faint and stubborn, to run again. And the valley came out of it changed. The old builder, Walter Hale, took to drafting a set of written plans that spring. Careful diagrams, the angle of the shafts, the grade of the trench, the one measurement above all that must never be cut past, no matter how badly a man might want more light. He added the buffer too, the wool and hay trick she had improvised in Barrow's failing shelter in the dark. And this time, he wrote her name to it. He had left it off, the first set of plans, an omission that had quietly stung Della when she noticed, though the widow herself had never once remarked upon it. But this time, Hale wrote it plain. The Veil Buffer. She looked at those two words a long while when he showed her, and she did not say anything. But something in her chest that had been clenched tight for longer than the winter, for longer than the year, for as long as she could clearly remember, let go. Just a little. Just enough. Silas Barrow began clearing ground for a proper stone shelter of his own before the frost was fully out. He never spoke much of that night. He was not a man made for speeches, but he came by once near the start of the warm season, and he left a cord of split, seasoned wood stacked neat by her cabin door. He did not knock. He did not wait to be thanked. He just built her woodpile back up, higher than it had been since her husband died, and rode away. Thaddeus Roone was the last. He came on a still evening near the end of the thaw, when the light fell long and gold across the valley and the worst of the season was behind them all. He stood with her a while at the mouth of her cave, the two of them looking out at the land, and then, without her asking, without any warning at all, he began to speak. He told her about a country far to the west, about mining cuts and sudden storms, about a younger brother. He told her about crawling into the stone to wait out a storm the way any sensible soul would, and never crawling back out. He told her about 3 days of digging, about being the one who found the body, about a lifetime of never once setting foot inside an enclosed stone space, and never once speaking of why. I fought you, he said, because I'd already watched the earth swallow somebody I loved, and I couldn't stand to watch it happen twice. His voice was low, stripped clean of the certainty he had once carried into her cave like a weapon. It was never about you being a woman, or your method being a fool's method. I was afraid you'd prove some terrible thing about what stone can take from a person who trusts it too far. Merritt listened, all the way through, without once interrupting, and when he had finished, she was quiet a long moment. She could have been cruel. He had earned some of it. She could have reminded him of the word he'd used, in front of witnesses, because he wanted it remembered. She did none of that. The stone took your brother because of bad luck, she said gently. Not bad design. There's a difference, and it's the whole difference in the world. She looked out at the gold light on the snow. I'm sorry that happened to you, she said, but I couldn't carry the blame for it, any more than I could carry the blame for every barn that failed in this valley, every winter, for longer than either of us has been alive. Roone was quiet a long while. I know that now, he said finally. I think some part of me always knew it. He turned his hat slowly in his weathered hands. I just needed a winter cold enough to burn the rest of it out of me. He did not apologize again after that. and she never once asked him to, because she had learned across that long and solitary year that some people carry their corrections quietly, folded into changed behavior rather than repeated words, and she had come to understand that quiet currency is worth just as much as any spoken regret. More, perhaps, because words are cheap in a hard country, and a stacked woodpile, and a shared silence, and a man finally speaking his dead brother's name aloud after a lifetime of holding it. Those things are not cheap at all. The warm season came on, full and green. Her animals walked out of the cave into open pasture, in better condition than any other stock in the valley, her horses holding their weight, her cows heavy with the coming calves. The early calf, the one she had pulled by lantern light with her arm in past the wrist, growing sturdy and strong in the new grass. Across the rest of the basin, other ranchers spent that same season counting their dead and reckoning their losses and building one by one some version of the thing she had made. By the turn of the next cold season, shelters cut into stone stood scattered across the whole valley, some full caves, like her own, some hybrids, timber built against rock, with her buffer packed careful into every seam. And the thing nobody called a tomb anymore. Nobody laughed anymore, either. She never grew rich from it. She never asked to. She helped those who came to her, and she charged the ones who could pay, and she waived the fee entirely for the ones who could not. She never sought to own the idea, or to keep it, or to hold it back from anyone who needed it, because she had not built the cave to make her name. She had built it because a lamb had frozen against a wall, because a calf had died in her hands in 6 short hours, because a good man had frozen defending a wall that never should have needed him. She had built it to stop her own arithmetic of loss from repeating, and it had done that, and more. Sometimes, on the quiet evenings, she would stand at the mouth of her cave and look out at the valley settling into dusk, the same threshold where a man had once stood, in front of a crowd, shaking his head and calling her the most dangerous thing he'd seen attempted on that land. The horses grazed in the near pasture, unhurried, indifferent to all the argument their shelter had once stirred. And behind her, deep in the stone, the same steady warmth held that had held through every storm the mountain could summon. Patient, indifferent, at peace. She thought sometimes of her husband, and the wall he had died defending. She thought of the difference she had learned across that hardest of years. The difference between effort that only looks like courage and effort that actually solves the thing in front of you. She thought of Rune, and his brother's name, spoken at last into the gold evening air. She thought of Barrow's woodpile, stacked high by her door, and of Della, who had ridden past her cave a dozen times in silence, and then become the truest friend she had, and of the early calf, grown now, alive in the pasture below her, alive only because the stone had given its mother just enough warmth to survive a night that should have taken them both. None of it had been certain when she started. None of it had come easy. But it had come, season by season, correction by correction, one patient proof at a time, until the argument that had once swallowed a whole valley had quieted at last into something close to ordinary fact. The earth had never cared whether anyone believed in it. It had simply gone on holding its warmth, year after year, indifferent to the mockery, indifferent to the praise, asking nothing at all of the people who finally learn to trust it, except that they pay attention long enough to understand what it had been offering them all along. She pulled her coat a little tighter against the first cool breath of the coming season, and she turned from the mouth of the cave, and she walked back toward the cabin where a small fire waited, and a warm supper, and the quiet that no longer felt like loneliness. The valley settled into dusk around her, the way it had 1,000 times before, patient and unhurried, and at last, entirely at peace with the woman who had refused to leave it.